Welcome to The Aftermath, a podcast that rips the Band-Aid off the collective scars of divorce, custody battles, and the trauma of family drama. Kendra Reiber and Mick Smith pull back the curtain and explore stories that put the heart-wrenching puzzle pieces together with inspiring stories, notable experts, and actionable tips. Let the healing begin. Well, welcome to The Aftermath, the He Said, She Said segment. And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital, and Kendra, our legislative advocate. How are you today, Kendra?
I'm wonderful. I'm excited to talk about this He Said, She Said episode because we're talking about Charlie McCready's episode, correct?
Oh, yes. Wasn't that something?
It was. It was so insightful. I think you and I were so capsulated by it. I had to go back and listen to it again.
Three things to help children through parental alienation. Number two was reduce damage after trauma. And number three, to restoring personal mental health. And so that was the goal. And then I agree with you. Then we started listening to what Charlie had to say. And it's like, there are a lot of really good ideas here and a lot of things. So I wanted to comment and I'll get your comment too. One of the things I wanted to chat with you about and ask your opinion. I can't represent all men and fathers, and you can't represent all mothers and women. But here's an idea that he's got a group, and I'm wondering about the small group size. And I know this was one of the things that helped me and find a small group. But do you think that that type of approach, not too large, not too small, and not one on one, would be effective? And I see, I would come back to say it is, and I'm telling you why. I think in a large group, I would get lost and I wouldn't necessarily want to share anything that was overly personal with such a large group. And then if it's one on one, I'm not even sure there. But I think when you get into a smaller group, it's not too large, not too small, but you're hearing people who are going through something very similar to what you did. And I think it's relatable. But that's my 2 cents. And I'm very curious to see what your thoughts were and what Charlie was saying.
No, I agree with you, Mick. I think it's absolutely a great idea. And it was the first time I had actually heard about this and having a smaller group. I think he kind of tries to match up, and I could be wrong, but I think he tries to match up your alienation stories. So it's kind of similar. So you can have somebody that's going through the same thing, or maybe that was one or two steps ahead of you, or maybe you're one or two steps ahead of them so that you can help each other. And I thought it was absolutely wonderful that it continued after
Mm.
the 9-week program, and you had mentors and people you could reach out to, and I think you create a special bond with those people.
And that's it. I think the follow-up is good too, because it's not like it's a one-shot deal. And I think one of the points that he made, and curious what you thought, I said there's an analogy. It's something like what Kubler-Ross talked about in when it came down to grief, but not exactly the same because the child or children are not really gone. They're still there. But that was an interesting point, and I was curious what you were thinking about that and what it felt like, and what does it feel like to you going through a process?
I had the same thing written down, Mick. I thought it was very insightful that he said, "You're not only grieving your loss now, but you're grieving your loss for the future." And I thought, wow, that is really insightful because it's true. You know that you are unsure of your future. You're grieving that because you're not going to see them in a typical divorce all the time that you would if you were married. But in addition, you're grieving that you don't even know what that looks like in the future or if you're going to see them at all. In addition to the grief that you're going through now, and he mentioned a 12-step program through grief, and I thought that was very interesting because you go through anger and denial and all of those, and
Mhm,
then you get to a point where you're accepting it.
mhm.
And once you start accepting it is when you can start healing.
Yeah, so here's another point too that I wanted to bring up and ask your opinion about too. But the traits of the alienator was pretty fascinating. I mean, it was kind of blunt and it's sort of direct, but he says, okay, this is a person who wants to do you in, right? And just you recognize that the alienator is after you and they're using the child or children to harm you. And it's like stating it bluntly, but yeah, that's true. And this is one of the things that we've talked about the experts, and I ask them all almost the same question, like, well, how is it that people don't recognize that parental alienation is a real thing because the people that you're dealing with they really are trying to get you. You feel like, no, the world isn't collapsing around you. That's what the person is attempting to do. So I'm curious what you were thinking.
So alienators, he pointed out several things. They're very vulnerable, they're insecure, and they're very protective because of an event or trauma that happened to them when they were younger. So this is just how they're dealing with it because
Mhm,
they've never had the therapy to actually deal with that trauma. So it
mhm.
just kind of keeps carrying on generation and generation, which is extremely sad to see. But I think if you put it in perspective, when you get out of that grief process and you understand and you accept, you start understanding and almost have a sense of feeling bad maybe for the person that you were with because they've never dealt with that. And so now you're not only dealing with your kids' trauma, you're dealing with your ex's trauma.
Yeah, and that's a good point because one of the things I was thinking about, having gone through the process, and I go, I have these really incredibly qualified psychiatrists, supposedly, Ivy League and all the credentials and everything else. And I'm going through this and I'm saying, gee, wouldn't it have been really insightful if they actually had given me some actionable ideas and I could have understood this a little bit better? I mean, I was certainly paying for it. So I thought, well, guys, why don't you help me out here a little bit? Because it's seeming like the situation is out of control, and this is a person I don't really know how to deal with, and it would have been really helpful, and that's why I thought, what Charlie was saying was really right on point for a lot of reasons.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And then it takes us into restoring our own mental health. And I took away a lot with that because I don't think that's something we've addressed too much on our podcast. And he
True.
just hit some of the tips that we need to be happy, right? We need to give ourselves permission to be happy and move on with our lives. We're given a second chance. And so take our kids out of the equation. And I'm using air quotes for those that can't see me because we need to move on. Not that we forget about our kids, not that we want to stop that relationship, but we need to still live a happy life. And we're allowed to do that.
And what was your word for this year, Kendra, for 2023?
It was happy.
Oh, okay, just curious, that's what I thought it might have been. So, yeah, we feel as though we're strong, right? And that's what that was your word for last year, and I agree because I was kinda do like, "Yep, I'm the strong silent type anyway, I'm the man, I'm the husband," those are the ideas in my head. But I said, "You know what? I do have a right to be happy, and it does take a long time to grasp that," and that was one of the things that Charlie brought out. Now, here's one of the things that I was thinking of, and I hadn't thought of it until we had talked to Charlie himself. And I'm not a math person, but I said, "You know what? It reminded me of, think of the Venn diagram." And I said,
Hmm.
"That's really cool because there's you, there's the child, there's the other person, and you intersect at some points, but you realize with a Venn diagram, yeah, but there's a whole part that's me, and it's not really involving that other person or the child or children." So that image had never come to me, and that's what I thought that was really insightful when Charlie was talking about that. So Venn diagram,
Hmm.
who would have thunk it, right?
Yeah, I really like that visual. I'm a visual person. So that is a great relation there is having that Venn diagram. I think he maybe used universe, but I like Venn diagram better because we do intersect, but there's areas that we don't connect with our kids, and that's okay. We don't need to, but we still can have that overlap. I like that, Mick. I like that. I might put a Venn diagram up on my wall. I like that.
Well, this is from a lot of years in education. There's 3 main types of learning styles, and visual is one of them. And, when I write, I often will sketch things out. I'll just take a blank piece of paper, 8.5 by 11, and just write sketching. And I go, well, part of it is because I can visualize things as well and then project it. But I think that visual makes sense. And I had never thought of that until Charlie. So I really appreciate the interview. I wanted to touch on this. When we were starting the podcast and when I'm writing the novel, it's Burning America, I kept thinking about American context, but Charlie reveals, and we've also had other people from other parts of the world. I said, this is more of an international issue. And I think that's what people are addressing. I think the family is under attack along everybody's lines and everybody's place. And that's what reminded me of it. And along those lines, I was looking at where the podcast is listening to or listened to. The aftermath is number 29 in Malaysia and number 27 in Brazil in the kids and parenting section. So I thought, there's people that are listening. So we appreciate our international listeners as well.
Yes. I think at first when I started my journey, I thought this was just the US and our messed up court systems.
Hmm.
But the more I'm learning, Mick, it's really a psychological problem because a parent is manipulating the children. And so even though the court systems don't understand it and inadvertently they're supporting it, it's a worldwide problem is because it's the psychology behind it.
Did you have any thoughts on the Ohio bill? Because we've talked about legislation before, and I looked to take a look at the National Parents Organization, which I highly encourage everybody to look at. A great organization, lots of resources. They have a nice little graphic poster, like what's fast facts. And Ohio is moving in the direction that we would like to see in the co-parenting. So you have any thoughts on the new legislative session in Ohio?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm super excited. We're waiting to get our number assigned to us this week. Once we have a
Good.
bill number, then it will actually go in front of committee
Hmm.
and we will start discussing with our state reps
Good.
and then maybe getting in front of them to tell our stories. Really excited about that. But I think the big thing is, in that one is instead of a presumption, if I'm saying that right,
Presumption.
uh,
Right.
where you are someone can just take evidence in and assume that you are being abusive. You now have to have clear and convincing evidence is what's in
Hmm.
the bill. And I think that's going to prevent a lot of inappropriate, not needed, not domestic disputes, I guess I should say. So there's obviously child abuse, and we want to keep those people away. But as long as there's clear and convincing evidence, that should be pretty easy, right? But the ones that are just assumed and well, that it maybe could have happened, and the judge sides with them, no, you're going to have clear and convincing evidence in order to separate the children from
Right.
the parent. And I
Yeah,
think that's very important.
I do too. So the assumption is moving in the direction of co-parenting, and then, of course, they're very cautious about saying, Let's really have some good evidence before we let somebody just kind of badmouth the other person because you and others are really victims of this." Like, well, I'm just gonna make a loose accusation, and there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction on behalf of the court. So I think the bill does have a lot of good provisions in it, and hopefully a model for some other states. Got an open invitation to my local representative in California here, so I'm gonna see what happens. No word yet, but, I'm not gonna give up. I'm gonna keeping at it, keep knocking at
That's
the
right.
door.
That's right. Don't be afraid to reach out to them. That's what they're there for.
Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on just a couple of things that Charlie brought up that I think some of us don't recognize. And it's because we're involved so much and we're hurting so much from not seeing our own children. When we do get a hold of them, we bombard them, right?
Mhm.
How's school? Tell me about your friends, how your sports going, your extracurriculars. We just bombard them with questions and we're just quizzing them. And they're like, wait a second. And they'll start to shut down because that's what the alienator is doing as well.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
we don't want to do that. We want to very short conversations if we do have contact with them, and we need to keep in mind that the alienator is reviewing all text messages, emails, social contact, whatever that might be, cards we're sending. So be aware that all of that is being reviewed and can ultimately be used against the children if, for some reason the alienator wants to pull that up, right? So just keep it very general, keep it happy, tell them what you're doing with your life, and don't say, "I miss you," because that makes them feel guilty. That was a big one for me because that's tough, right? You
Huge.
think that you should tell them that you miss them. They already know that you miss them. They know that, right? So don't tell them because then they feel even more guilty because they're stuck with the alienator and they can't get out of that and they can't change the situation. So don't say, "I miss you."
Yes, and it's so natural, right? And I go that,
It
yes,
is.
if I had talked to Charlie some years ago, that's like, yeah, I wouldn't have said that. But it's the obvious thing you say, right? The child you see, you haven't seen him for a while. Yeah, I miss you. And thing, just a sidelight. My mom told me at one time she would say she always regretted the end of summer. And I go, why, mom? She said, well, because you guys went back to school. I
Mm.
missed you. And I go, well, yeah, because that's what parents do. We missed you and you had been around all summer. And then all of a sudden you're back at school and then the house is empty. So it's a natural thing. But I think that was one of those really great takeaways from Charlie. And as along those lines, he also said, kids just want to be kids. And I go, yeah,
Yes.
so simple, but so true. They just want to be a kid, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They don't want to be caught up in it. So they do. They just want to live their life. And I thought something else too is the children wanna see you happy. So kinda going back to
Hmm.
what we were
Yep.
talking about a few minutes ago, but moving on with your life, they wanna see you happy. They wanna see you stable. That gives them also a clear conscience that things are still okay. Even though they're not talking to you, you can still influence them that way. and if they're seeing you on social media or whatnot, they know that you're okay. So being happy for you is a good influence for them.
Yep, and I got a buddy that goes through this, and I said, when the child is around, I like to show up. I go, "What's the point?" I go, "Well, that child needs to know that, see, here's a parent who has a friend or friends and has other things going on," because that's another key insight that Charlie brought to mind. Said that child wants to see you happy and strong and being a parent, and that's what attracts them because they are under a lot of pressure the way it is. And
Mhm.
what they want to see is that you're the alternative. You're not someone who's manipulative. You're not someone who's controlling. You are just a happy, well adjusted individual. And I think that's a really important insight.
Mhm. What did you think about when he had mentioned coaching your families? So you not only have to go through it personally yourself and understand the grieving process and know how to talk to your children, but now you're coaching extended families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, those that don't even understand it, or friends, right? We've talked
Yeah.
about this before.
Yeah.
People that don't understand it think we're crazy and we must have done something to deserve it. And Charlie, I think, even brought that up. And we didn't do anything. But how do we coach our families?
Yeah. And I think that is an important insight because you find that for men, address men first of all, because men get tired of hearing it, right? So, because men, we are more action oriented often, we are direct and we solve problems. I mean, that's what we think we're doing. Women know it's not always
Yes.
true, but, that's what we think.
Yes.
So, when you're dealing with other men who are your friends, they start to say, like, well, haven't you solved this? Why didn't you solve this problem? And why does it go on month after month, year after year? So you do have to coach your friends and family to say, no, this is not something that I can just snap my fingers and it's all going to be good. You do have to coach and you have to find the right people because sometimes your friends and your family are not really that friendly and not that family oriented because they start to tune you out and they can't understand what you're going through. You have to coach them. It's a good
Mhm.
point.
Well, and I think if anybody's starting to go through the very beginning of alienation, they need to know that takes a lot of energy as well. So, any books, any podcast, such as this one, anything you're reading, listening to on audio, send to your family members so they start to understand more the psychology that's behind it, not just the court systems, but how they can help you versus how they could hurt you. Because that's something Charlie brought up, is
Mhm.
sometimes they will reach directly out to the children themselves and say, "Why are you doing this to your mom or dad?" Well, that is only hurting the situation. So ways that our families can help support us, and if they're talking to the children, what to say and what not to say.
Yep. It brings up memories. And I'll tell you, it's one of those things that mom and dad were in Arizona. I was living in Pennsylvania at the time, and mom came by herself and said it was one of the saddest and most depressing times in my entire life. She shows up at the airport, and it would have been one of those things to have great to have the reunion. We haven't seen you for a while, but I thought, man, what a depressing time it was because she had come all this way. It's 3,000 miles. And then there were some incidents or two that were not happy and not very family oriented, but trying to tell people what you are going through and what part of the process you are. And I think that's a really valid point to try to find other resources, especially the aftermath, because that's what we're trying to do. But books and coaches, podcasts, and things that can help people understand what you're going through.
Yeah. So I thought it was absolutely amazing. Charlie was great, wealth of knowledge. I think we went through all of my notes. I could keep going, but I will stop there for time purposes.
Well, what I would say is it's a great episode. And two, we split it up. And I said, if you have not listened to Charlie, I thought it was a wealth of knowledge, lots of great tips. And yet, said I thought it was highly recommended that people listen to it. And I appreciate your comments and your thoughts because there were things that I was wondering what you were wondering and what your reactions were. So I appreciate your input. And although it was a great session, sounded good to me.
Yeah, same here, Mick. And for everybody that's listening, Mick and I don't talk about these sessions and we just get on here and talk. This is really live. We don't rehearse this. This is raw. So I'm glad Mick and I were able to share and be on the same page on some of these things. Sometimes we differ, but this time I think we're on the same page.
Well, it was a good session, and that's what the absolutely true. It's live and unrehearsed. So what you're hearing is our real off the cuff understanding and our reaction. So we appreciate everybody listening. And of course, we do have a call to action, don't we, Kindred? And we have something to offer listeners now.
I actually think we do.
We have a ebook that we love people listen to, and you can get that at the aftermathhealing at gmail.com. So please get in touch with us. We'd love to be able to send that to you. And of course, as always, subscribe, like, share, and positively review where, Kendra?
Any of the platforms that you're on. As long as you subscribe to our podcast, then you will get notifications of our new drops.
That sounds fantastic. Positively review us. It helps build the show, and we appreciate your support. Thanks for everybody listening. Until next time, this is Kendra and Mick signing off. Deus Volt.